Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And for today's episode, we're going to go back to the decade of my birth, the 1970s, and rank the studio albums by the one and only king of rock and roll, Mr. Elvis Presley. Now, as a lifelong diehard Elvis Presley fan, I celebrate the guy's entire career, beginning with his early days as a rockabilly hellraiser. From the soundtracks to 68, I'm pretty much on board every step of the way. Now, that being said, if I were forced to choose an era of Elvis Presley's career that I find to be the most interesting, dare I say my favorite, it would probably be the 1970s. I love everything about Elvis in the 1970s. I love the studio albums, I love the live recordings, I love the jumpsuits, and I love the concert films. It was an era where Elvis climbed to his highest heights and suffered his lowest lows. And of course, as we are all aware, the 1970s were a decade that Elvis did not make it out of alive. But during the seven and a half years that he lived during the 1970s, Elvis Presley recorded 13 studio albums. Now, I realize that Elvis Presley is much like the Grateful Dead. Just don't tell him that I said that. But it's true in the sense that when it comes to the real die-hard fan base, a lot of Elvis Presley fans are more interested in going back and listening to the live recordings and the concert tapes of the 1970s. That being said, each one of these 13 studio albums in its own way are important, provocative, and historically significant. And, if I don't mind saying so myself, some damn fine music. Each one of these records are in their own way enjoyable and feature some of the best work he ever did, at least in my opinion. So let's get into this ranking just a little bit. As I just mentioned before, Elvis Presley released 13 studio albums throughout the 1970s. This ranking list will contain 11 of those 13 studio albums. The two that are sort of omitted from today's ranking list are omitted because these are records that sort of fall into their own categories. These are also records that I am not quite as familiar with, based on the fact that these are records that I haven't really listened to as much as a lot of the other material in Elvis's catalog. And believe it or not, this may surprise you, but when it comes to this channel, I usually try to curb the conversation into topics that I'm at least somewhat knowledgeable about. Now, I realize that my lack of articulation works against me more often than not, but generally speaking, those are the rules in which I try to follow. So the two albums that you will not be hearing much about on today's ranking from the 1970s, and all of these records come from the 1970s. These records span from 1970 to 1977. This is Elvis Presley's 11 studio albums from the 1970s. The two that you will not be hearing anything about, except for right now, is Elvis Presley's gospel record from the 1970s. He Touched Me. Now, this is a record that I do own. It's not a record that I listen to very often. This is nothing against gospel music, and this is nothing against you personally. If you are a fan of gospel music, this is a record that I just really never listen to. I am, personally speaking, not really the hugest fan of gospel music. That is in no way an attack on people of faith. It just happens to be something that I don't find particularly interesting. The other record that we will not be talking much about during this ranking is Elvis's Christmas album from the 1970s, which is The Wonderful World of Christmas. Now, like gospel music, Christmas music is something that I'm, generally speaking, not really a big fan of. There's about 3 days a year when I can stomach Christmas music without wanting to honk in my socks. That being Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and maybe Boxing Day. Apart from that, most of my Christmas music is shelved during the remainder of the year. This Elvis record, no different. Actually, I don't even think that I own Wonderful World of Christmas by Elvis, to be perfectly honest with you. I do have a Christmas playlist on my Spotify account, which I will bust out, like I said, maybe 2 or 3 days a year. And it contains some of those Elvis Christmas recordings. But apart from that, every other studio album from Elvis in the 1970s is featured on this ranking list. There are 11, all in all. And I got to tell you that some of these records actually kind of surprised me in terms of where they fell in the ranking. There are a couple that were not very surprising at all. In fact, the bottom two of this ranking list were two that I pretty much figured would be sort of where they are. These are two records that I don't listen to very often, and one, you'll find out why in just a second, which surprised me as well. But like I said before, these are 11 of Elvis Presley's studio albums from the 1970s, and at least in my opinion, this is my favorite era of Elvis Presley's career. I find this to be the most interesting era of his career. And of course, sadly, Elvis did not make it out of the decade alive. But fortunately for us, and fortunately for the world, at least, he left us this tremendous gift of some of these, I think, just incredible recordings. There isn't really a bad record in this lot. There's only 11, so there's not a lot of clunkage when it comes to the records that are on this list. And like I said, even the ones that are at the very bottom, a couple of them I was pretty sure would rank kind of where they were. These are not bad records. A lot of these records have some really incredible music on them. A lot of Elvis's greatest vocal performances, in my opinion, came from the 1970s. I think that's one of the things about Elvis in the 1970s that I appreciate the most. Now, of course, I love, as I mentioned before, I celebrate the guy's entire career. I love 50s Elvis. I love rockabilly Elvis. I like a lot of the soundtrack work within reason, as we've talked about in the past. I mean, you can't excuse all of the soundtracks, but generally speaking, I'm a pretty big fan of a lot of the soundtrack work. But for me, one of the things about Elvis in the 1970s that musically stands out was the way that his voice continued to develop and it matured. And I mean, some of these recordings in the 1970s, and especially when you go back and listen to good live recordings and you go back and watch good live video, I mean, it's almost operatic. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be born with a voice like Elvis Presley's. So to me, that is one of the biggest draws for me of the 1970s is the way the way he sort of grew into his voice and the way he sort of learned to control his voice. To me, these are probably my favorite records of Elvis's career. Now, of course, I love going back and listening to the early rockabilly stuff, but if I were sent to a desert island and I could only take Elvis records from one era, don't put me in that position. But I think I'm taking the 70s records. I really do. So, anyway, let's get into this without any further ado. Number 11, out of the 11, not counting the Gospel and the Christmas album, was released on July 16th, 1973. This is the Elvis 1973 album, often referred to by fans as the Fool album. Now, this is an album that I don't really listen to very often, and I just sort of discovered why about 10 minutes ago when I was digging these records out of my collection to present to you on today's episode, because apparently I don't even own this album, which I admit is disgusting. It's unacceptable. I apologize for my inexcusable behavior. I throw myself on the mercy of the court. But I promise you this, I am going to remedy this situation as soon as possible. My wife and I are heading down to Birmingham, Alabama this weekend for her birthday. And I can assure you that we are going to be doing some record shopping while we are in Birmingham, because the record stores down in Birmingham are pretty snug. So mark my words that I will be picking up a copy of the Fool album by Elvis. I'm literally shocked that I don't own this album, because I have a lot of records over there. I'm not going to give you any numbers, but I have a lot of records. And I have a lot of Elvis records. And I was just thumbing through, and I apparently don't own this record, but I know it well enough to know that it is probably my least favorite of the 1970s studio albums, because I think it has sort of a weaker collection of songs. I also have to say, as much as I just slobbered all over Elvis's voice in the 1970s, this record, to me, his voice is a little bit shallow. It's a little bit weak. He feels a little bit kind of less interested on this album. And I think that even though Elvis, especially during certain parts of the 1970s, he was going through a lot of professional lethargy, but he generally sort of masked it pretty well on the studio records, whereas on this one, I feel like his performance is relatively weak. Like I said, this is a record I don't really listen to. Apparently, I don't own it. Not very happy about that, son. But it does have, that being said, it's his weakest album of the 70s, in my opinion, but it's still about half really good. It does have some clunkage on it. I don't necessarily love his voice on some of it. For his standards, I always love his voice, but it's a little weak in parts. I love the title track, Fool. I love the song, Where Do I Go From Here? I love the song, It's Still Here. Padre is pretty good. I really like his version of the Bob Dylan song, Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. Now, of course, it's not as good as the Bob Dylan version. If you want to hear a really good version of Don't Think Twice, It's Alright, check out the live album, or the solo album by Social Distortion frontman Mike Ness, Cheating at Solitaire. He does an excellent version of Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. If I had to pick a favorite song off of the Fool album, it would be the live version of It's Impossible. I think that's pretty easy. All right, now the rest of these albums I own. Again, I apologize. Unacceptable behavior on my part. Let's try to move on and enjoy ourselves, if you don't mind. But we're already in the top 10. We made it. See, it wasn't that hard. Come on. Anyway, number 10. The very next album in chronology, Behind Fool. This record was released on October 1st, 1973, produced by Felton Jarvis. And that is the Elvis Presley record, Raised on Rock. This is an album that I think is markedly better than Fool. As I said before, the Fool record being my least favorite album of the 1970s, it's still a good record. It's unfortunate that some of these albums have to sort of be relegated towards the bottom of this ranking because they're all good. None of them are bad. None of these records are like unlistenable. But this record is, I would say, is markedly better than Fool. In my opinion, Fool is sort of by far the weakest album of the 1970s. Now, again, I don't think it's a bad record, but this record is much better. I like the production on this record a lot better. I like the song selection on this record much better. I would make the argument, though, that like on the Fool record, I feel that Elvis's vocal performance on this record is a little bit off. He sounds a little bit sort of disinterested. I've read that following the Aloha shows in January of 1973, that Elvis really sort of hit a pretty heavy depression coming off of those shows, and it sort of sounds like it on these two studio records. This is another record where I feel that Elvis is sort of struggling a little bit to mask his boredom, his lethargy. And I talked about this earlier on this channel. When Elvis was challenged, he always rose to that challenge above and beyond what people could have ever possibly expected. But oftentimes after meeting a challenge, he would sort of emotionally sort of sink back down. And these two records, Fool and Raised on Rock, I feel as if it kind of feels as if Elvis is not really in the best sort of mental state. That being said, like Fool, this record does have a lot of pretty decent material on it. I like the song Are You Sincere? I like the song Girl of Mine, for old time's sake, which is sort of one of the title tracks. I like the song Sweet Angeline. But my favorite song off this record, if I had to pick one, I would say my favorite song off this record is If You Don't Come Back. So for me, this is number 10 of the 1970s. I like this record. This is one I listen to less. It is. I don't listen to it quite as less as I listen to Fool, but for me, it's a record that I can go pretty big gaps in time in between. Number 9, this album was released on January 7th, 1971, produced by Felton Jarvis. And this is the Elvis Country album. I'm 10,000 years old. This is a record that I like a lot more than Raised on Rock and Fool. This is a record, of course, that was recorded 1970, came out in 1971. Elvis is, you can tell that he's feeling pretty energized in 1971. I feel like Elvis was kind of like on top of the world, 1970, 1971. The thing about this record that, why it's sort of farther down in my ranking is I'm just not really the biggest country music guy in the world. Now, I know that, especially throughout the 1970s, Elvis's music was just heavily tinged with country, but this one is a little bit much, at least in my opinion. However, I have to say that this album does have probably my second favorite Elvis Presley song of all time, which is Snowbird. And I'll say this about this record, and why this record is actually higher for me than Raised on Rock and Fool is because even though this song, or this record probably has, by number, it probably has, or by volume, it probably has less songs that I really like compared to those first two records. But the songs that I really like on this record, the good songs on this record, are way better, I think, than the songs that I like off Raised on Rock and Fool. I love the song Snowbird, Tomorrow Never Comes. Little Cabin on the Hill is okay. I don't like a whole lot of shaking going on. I never have. To me, that's just an association I have with Jerry Lee Lewis. And I've never liked Jerry Lee Lewis. I don't like him. Never have. Probably never will. Whenever Elvis does anything that makes me think of Jerry Lee Lewis, I'm not a fan of it. But I love the song Funny How Time Slips Away. There Goes My Everything is another one of my favorite Elvis songs of all time. That's one of my favorite live Elvis songs of all time. The Fool, Faded Love, Make the World Go Away, another one of my favorite Elvis tracks of all time, especially live. So, like I said, this record, although, in volume, it has maybe a couple, a few less songs I like than Raised on Rock and Fool. The ones I like, I just love. And Snowbird is probably my second favorite Elvis song of all time. And on this particular copy, if you can see through the cellophane, but it has I found this record many years ago, probably at a used record store, and it has a Sears sticker on it. Makes me think of my grandfather whenever I see anything with Sears, because my grandfather was the guy who just shopped at Sears for everything. Didn't matter what it was. He had one-stop shopping, and it was at Sears. There's a scene in an episode of King of the Hill where Hank Hill talks about how he likes buying his pants and his hammer at the same store so he can see how they look together. Totally reminds me of my grandpa. My grandpa was just the Sears guy. So every time I pull this record out and I see that Sears sticker, it always makes me think of my grandfather. All right. Now, number 8. This record was released on May 7th, 1975, produced by Felton Jarvis. It is the album Today. This is an album that I really like a lot. I think that this is an album. Now we're starting to get into the albums pretty quickly. We're only a few into this, and we're already starting to get into the albums that are much better than some of the stuff that was kind of coming up, sort of bringing up the rear. This is an album that I really like a lot. I actually listened to this album quite a fair amount. I love the sleeve on this picture. I love that particular jumpsuit. Elvis is still looking pretty trim, looking pretty healthy as well. This was one of the first albums of the 1970s that I actually bought. Like a lot of people, I think, when I first got into Elvis, The first Elvis album, or whatever you want to call it, I ever bought was, one of those sort of, I think it was the 20 number one hits. But when I first started buying Elvis music, I started from the 1950s because those were all the song titles, at least that I recognized. But I do think that this was the first album from the 70s that I actually bought as an album. This is a record that I would say I listened to a fair amount. Some of my favorite tracks off this one are the title track, Trouble, and I Love You So. Woman Without Love is awesome. Fairy Tale is awesome. Pieces of My Life is okay. I Can Help. Bringing It Back is good. But my favorite track on this record is the final track, which is The Green, Green Grass of Home. I have a trip planned back home to California in September to see friends and family. And whenever I get a trip booked back home to California, I start to feel a little bit homesick as the date approaches. And that song, Green, Green Grass of Home, always makes me feel, a little bit homesick, as it is anyway. All right, number 7. From March 20th, 1974, this album was also produced by Felton Jarvis. And this is the album Good Times. I really like this album a lot. This is a record that I never get tired of. This is a record that I think is not hugely better than the record before it today, but this is a record that I really like. This is a record that I listen to quite a bit. I think that this has some material on it that is actually somewhat underrated. I mean, I know you can't really say that Elvis is underrated. It makes you sound like a dope if you say that Elvis Presley is underrated. But as far as the studio albums from the 1970s go, I think that Good Times is probably the most underrated. This is a record I do listen to quite a bit. I love the picture on the sleeve. I like that particular jumpsuit. I love the photography. I love the sort of silhouette with the shadow. It's one of my favorite album covers of this era. For me, I really love the song Take Good Care of Her. Loving Arms. Got a Feeling in My Body is awesome. If That Isn't Love. She Wears My Ring is a song I really like a lot. My Boy is cool. Spanish Eyes. Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues. I like that song. I actually kind of think that song is a little bit overplayed. It's okay. It's not my favorite song of this record. My favorite song of this record is easy, and that is I've Got a Thing About You, Baby. Love that song. Off of my 7th album from the 1970s. 1974's Good Times. Number 6. This album was released on June 16th, 1971, produced by Felton Jarvis. This is a record that I listen to all the time. This is one of the records from the 1970s that, even though it's, kind of middle of the pack, this is a record that has some just killer tracks. I mean, the good songs on this album are the jugs, in my opinion. And that is Love Letters from Elvis. This is a record I first bought on CD. I remember thinking that this was a compilation the first time I bought it, thinking it was just a collection of love songs until I sort of started to read and learn more about Elvis's catalog. I didn't realize that this was a studio album when I first bought it. I thought it was more of a compilation. But this has some just kill. I mean, this album is... There's really not much clunkage on this record at all. I love his voice on this. It's 1971. You get the sense that he's still very much engaged at this point in his career. I love the album cover. I think the album cover would be a little bit better if it was maybe just, maybe one of the pictures, but I like the album cover. My favorite songs off this record, there's a lot of them. Love Letters, If I Were You, Got My Mojo Working, Heart of Rome is awesome. This is Our Dance. Oh man, I love that song. Life. But, oh my God. If I had to pick a favorite song off, this one's tough because there's two that I would choose as being my favorite songs off Love Letters. I'll say that I'll Never Know is my favorite song off this record. My second favorite song on this record is When I'm Over You. But those can go back and forth because I love both those songs. So I'll go with I'll Never Know for now. All right. Now we're in the top 5. See how easy this is? This album was released on February 20th, 1972, produced by Felton Jarvis and Chips Moman. This is the Elvis Presley record, Now. This is an album that contains a version of probably what is my favorite Elvis Presley song of all time, which is Early Morning Rain. My favorite version of Early Morning Rain is the version that appears on the bonus material for the Aloha from Hawaii CD. That's my favorite version of Early Morning Rain ever. I like the version on this record as well. Now this record, it may not... this one is tough. I would say this one and the one ahead of it were really close, because this one could easily be number 4, but I chose it to be number 5 just because the record ahead of it is just, in my opinion, slightly better. Just very slightly better. But this is number 5. This is a record I listen to a lot as far as the Elvis 70's albums go. This is a record that I never get tired of. There's really not much on this record to sneeze at all. This record is pretty snug start to finish. I love the song Help Me Make It Through the Night, Miracle of the Rosary. I love his version of Hey Jude. Put Your Hand in the Hand. Until It's Time for You to Go is okay. We Can Make the Morning is awesome. Sylvia is great. Fools Rush In is awesome. I Was Born 10,000 Years Ago. It's okay. It's good. There's not really a bad song on this record. You can't really say it's bad. But Early Morning Rain is my favorite. That's my favorite Elvis Presley song of all time. So regardless of what version it is. All right. Number 4. This record was released on June 19th, 1977. Right, not too long before Elvis Presley left the building permanently. He left the world with this tremendous gift, which to me is one of his greatest accomplishments, which is his final studio record, Moody Blue. Now, the reason why Moody Blue to me is number 4 and not higher, because it certainly could be higher, is because the first half of this record is all live material, which I'm not knocking. The live material on this record is the jugs. But the second half of this record is some of the greatest music that Elvis Presley ever made. And it's interesting because, at this point in time, by 1977, Elvis Presley was in very bad shape physically and emotionally, and I don't think he was all that engaged in his career at this point in time. And how he was able to manage creating this magnificent album is something that it baffles me, honestly, considering the shape he was in and considering the fact that he was, I'm not trying to be dark and morbid, but he was pretty close to the end. This record it never doesn't blow me away. Especially the second side on this record. Every song on the second side of this record is as good as anything he ever did in his entire life. The album starts off with a live version of Unchained Melody, and I've said this before about Elvis performing the song, especially late in his career. You go back and you watch the Elvis in concert video from 77. That live performance, it literally makes the hair on your body stand up. He was made to sing that song. That song was written for Elvis Presley. This version of it just knocks your head off. I like the song, If You Love Me, Let Me Know. That's another great live recording on this record. Little Darlin', it's fine. It's not necessarily like, earth-shattering like Unchained Melody, but it's a pretty good version of that song. He does it justice, at least. He'll Have to Go, which was recorded. He'll Have to Go is the only studio track on side one of this record, which I really like a lot. And side one closes out with the song Let Me Be There, which was actually recorded in Memphis in 1974 live. But side two of this record is, I think it's one of Elvis Presley's greatest accomplishments, is side two of Moody Blue. With the song Way Down, Pledging My Love, the title track, Moody Blue. His version of She Thinks I Still Care, which was written by Dickie Lee. Of course, the greatest version of She Thinks I Still Care is probably still the George Jones version, but this version of it is the jugs. And It's Easy for You. I mean, there's not a bad song on this entire album. I think if the entire album were as good as side two, this would not only be Elvis Presley's best record of the 70s, this might be his best record, period. Now, I still stand by the fact that I think Elvis Presley's best studio album is 1969's From Elvis in Memphis. And, this one is way up there. I mean, it's number 4 for me in the 1970s, but if side 1 were as good as side 2, I mean, this might be his best record. And the fact that this came out so near the end just blows me away. Way Down is the best song on this record. It's one of the best songs he ever did. All right, number 3. Whew. Now it's getting pretty tough. The top 4 were really difficult for me because Moody Blue... See, that's just a testimony to Elvis right there. The fact that Moody Blue is his 4th best record of a decade. It tells you everything you need to know. Anybody who questions the greatness of Elvis, first off, needs to go into therapy. 2, they probably haven't listened to his catalog. Because if Moody Blue's number 4, I mean, we're heading into the stuff of legends here, son. So number 3, this record is a record I listen to all the time. Extremely heavy rotation. This might actually be the Elvis Presley record that I listen to the most as far as studio albums go. Any era, this is probably the one I listen to the most. This record was released on January 8th, 1975, produced by Felton Jarvis. And on his 40th birthday, Elvis Presley gave himself one hell of a gift, because the cuts on this album are packed tighter than Mama Cass's girdle. And that is Promised Land. This record, start to finish, I mean, you can go through every single track if you want to. This album is as good as it gets, in my opinion. I remember when I first bought this record on CD, I had sort of not the highest expectations. I hadn't really bought much Elvis music past a certain point in time, at this point in time. I had Today, but I think this was one of the records that I bought, fairly early into my 70s collecting. And, the album artwork, although I like it, it's a little bit unambitious. It's not necessarily the greatest photograph of Elvis that I've ever seen. But I bought this record, I took it home, and it took my eyes, it pulled them out of my head, and it threw them in the garbage disposal. Because this record just kills you. Every cut on this record is the jugs. Oh my God. Promised Land, the title track Promised Land. Help Me, Mr. Songman, Love Song of the Year, It's Midnight, Your Love's Been a Long Time Coming, If You Talk in Your Sleep. I mean, You can't even pick a weakest song on this album. If I had to pick a favorite song on this album, though, it's not even fair. This record's so good. Oh, wait. If I had to pick a favorite, I don't know. If I had to pick a favorite song off Promised Land, all right, I'm going to go with "There's a Honky Tonk Angel Who'll Take Me Back In." And that's not fair because this album's so good. I'm going to go with that. But this is probably the Elvis album I listen to the most. Promised Land's number 3 from 1975. And number 2. Now this was really tough. The top 2 were really tough because I think either of these, well, like I said before, all of the top 4 could kind of like be manipulated here and there, but especially the top 2, because I feel like these 2 could sort of go either way, and I don't know, now that I'm here, I'm not feeling entirely confident with my decision, but I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to stick with it and say that my number 2 was released on November 11th, 1970, produced by Felton Jarvis, and that's the way it is. Which is such an incredible record. I mean, you can go through every track if you want. I mean, there isn't a bad song on this entire album, not to mention the fact that it's helped a little bit by being one of the greatest concert films ever made. The thing I love most about this film is, and I should say this before we move on, all of these records from the 1970s, we are going to do a deep dive into each one of these individually. I'm sort of summarizing quickly so we can keep the train running on time today. But all of these albums are going to get their own episodes at some point in time, I promise. But the thing I love the most about the That's the Way It Is film, and of course I love once the show starts, I love the live performance, but the thing I love the most about that movie is the first half of the movie when Elvis and his band are sort of working through the songs, the rehearsal, and the sort of behind-the-scenes glimpse at watching Elvis, practice his genius. I mean, Elvis obviously was not a songwriter. Elvis was not, these were not his compositions, but he took these songs and he arranged them and he made them his own. And to watch him work and watch him in his element when he was excited and, feeling challenged and eager to take these songs and put them on the stage, and watching how he interacted with his band and the backup singers and how seriously he took it, but at the same time how much fun he was having. And you could just sense that this was Elvis really sort of, re-engaging with himself. I mean, this was him, becoming interested once again in himself, especially after the 1960s when he was in this suffocating, potentially career-ending film contract. At a certain point in time, Elvis probably never thought he would be this guy again. He probably for a while thought he was going to be the cheese ball cartoon character who was flying helicopters or racing race cars. I mean, this is him at his peak. I mean, Elvis at his peak to me is 69 through 72-ish. 72 being like the New York 72, because the New York Live 72 record, I mentioned this before, I talked about that record on this channel. If I could only own one Elvis album, I mean, that Live at Madison Square Garden might be it. But man, Elvis in 1970, if I had a time machine and I could go back and see Elvis in Las Vegas in 1970, I'm there. I mean, this album does not have a single bad song on the entire album. Of course, it's sort of peppered with both live and studio recordings. I love the song I Can't Help Believin', 20 Days and 20 Nights, How the Web Was Woven, Patch It Up, Mary in the Morning, Bridge Over Troubled Water. My God. The next step is love. Are you serious right now? That song is The Jugs. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. I've Lost You, Just Pretend. Strangers in the Crowd. You can't go wrong with any of these songs. But I think my favorite song off this album is You Don't Have to Say You Love Me. I will say I love that song. All right. Well, we've made it to number 1. And this is a album that I listened to maybe not quite as much as Promised Land, honestly, even though I think it's a better record. I tend to listen to Promised Land, like I said, a lot. But this was a record I bought on CD originally the first time. And from the opening track, it pretty much blew me away. I mean, probably has the best opening track of any Elvis record ever, in my opinion. This record came out in May of 1976. Produced by Felton Jarvis. And it is from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee. To me, this is Elvis Presley's best album of the 1970s. This album doesn't have a bad second on the entire album. There's not a snoozer to be found. There isn't one single piece of clunkage. Am I making myself clear? I love this record. This is a record that, I mean, all 11 of these records are records that are essential. If you don't own all of these records, which I don't, sorry, but if you don't own all of these records, I don't know what you're doing with your life. I really don't. But this one in particular is just a must. This is an essential. This is probably Elvis Presley's finest record, start to finish. Starts off with the song Hurt, and immediately you're hooked. And it just carries you the rest of the way. Every song on this album, in my opinion, is awesome. Never Again, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. Oh my God. Danny Boy, The Last Farewell, For the Heart. Solitaire. Man. Love Coming Down. I'll Never Fall in Love Again. Bitter They Are, Harder They Fall. The pickup. There's not a least favorite song on this record. There's not a weakest song. It's not there. So don't even look. Don't ask me to pick one because I'm not. Best song? Oh my God. That's impossible. How can you? It's like not even fair to ask. Oh my God. If I had to pick a favorite song of this record, I'm going to go with Solitaire. Because it's just, I mean, I don't know. Now that I say that, I feel like I'm leaving other songs off that are as good. Because this whole album is, I think it's probably one of his greatest masterpieces he ever recorded. And I'll say this the same way I talked about, Moody Blue. The fact that this record came out, in May of 1976, he was only on this planet for another year and a few months after this record came out. This was probably a point in Elvis's career where he was not necessarily at the height of his game, especially live, but to go in and record a record like this and just sort of, knock it out. I mean, it just shows you, it's a testimony to how amazing, how unbelievable of a talent he was. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, earlier, Elvis unfortunately didn't make it out of the 1970s, but he left us this amazing gift, this collection of 11 or 13, really, records from the 1970s. My favorite era of his career. If I had to choose one era of Elvis Presley's career, it would be the 1970s. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, this is my number 1. So go back and check out from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee. Check out all of these records. You will not be sorry if you do. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, talk to you then.